All righty. Well, good evening, everybody. We'll get started with our town hall about the January session with State Senator Ann Gillespie and State Representative Mark Walker. My name is Austin Madrick. I'm the District Director for State Representative Mark Walker and will be your MC of sorts this evening. And so we'll turn it over to start to the Senator and the Representative.
Thank you, Austin. It's great to be with you all today. I am very much looking forward to when we can do these in person again. Hopefully, when we're done with the spring session, we'll be in a position where we can do that. So in the meantime, this worked out well for tonight, given the snow. So hopefully you're all someplace safe and warm, and we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to walk through the different bills that were passed during the January session of that was the last part of the 101st General Assembly before we swore in the 102nd General Assembly. So I'm going to take the first few topics and then we're going to turn it over to Mark. Is there anything you'd like to say before we get started, Mark?
Well, thank you. I just thank everyone for coming to the meeting. I wish we could do it in person. It's been a challenging year and it continues to be. There are a lot of very difficult priorities that we have to solve, but we made some good steps in the past few weeks, and I look forward to going through it.
All right, Jack, if you want to go ahead with the slide. Okay, we're going to be talking tonight about some essential worker protections that relate specifically to COVID, healthcare transformation and the healthcare pillar that was part of the Black Caucus pillars, the Seclusion Room bill that I've been working on, vote by mail extension, and the remainder of the Black Caucus pillars. Just as a quick overview, there were 4 Black Caucus pillars addressing social justice issues: healthcare, education, economic opportunity, and criminal justice. So we're going to be going through all 4 of those tonight. Next slide, please. So the healthcare, the essential workers, first responder protections. These were protections that were passed back in May that allowed access to, declared that workers' comp applied in a situation for essential workers and first responders, that if they came down with COVID and they were not working at home, that it was presumed they contracted it at the workplace. However, the employer has a rebuttable, can defeat that rebuttable presumption by proving that they were fully compliant with all IDPH and CDC guidelines for their specific industry, in which case the employee would then have to prove through evidence that they contracted it at the workplace. Those, when we passed them in May, they were set to expire in December 31st. So with agreement with the Manufacturers Association, the Retail Association, and other work groups, we extended those protections through June 30th of 2021. Next slide, please. The healthcare transformation. This is an initiative of the Medicaid department, the Department of Health and Family Services, along with the General Assembly. We had a healthcare transformation bill that passed in 2016. However, it never was fully implemented. And so what happened with the money that was appropriated, it ended up going back into regular operations because the programs that were supposed to be implemented for transformation were never fully defined. So what we did this time, that program expired this year. So what we did this time is we wanted to make sure we had it all defined up front, because the goal of this program is to change the way that we deliver healthcare through Medicaid so that we can improve outcomes and that we're focusing on outcomes. So what this is going to do is the state has set aside $150 million, depending on federal matching money. This money came from a combination of the General Revenue Fund and the hospital and healthcare assessments that is a tax that hospitals pay, and federal matching funds that are available through the Medicaid program. So there were 3 different sources for the money. $150 million each year for 3 years. And what this is going to do is it's going to fund projects that are submitted by groups of safety net and critical access hospitals. Safety net hospitals are hospitals that receive over 50% of their revenue from Medicaid. Critical access hospitals are hospitals that are in rural areas generally that are less than 100 beds, and generally the only hospital within a 50-mile or more radius, and federally qualified healthcare centers who would partner with other hospitals in their community to focus on a particular aspect of healthcare and pilot new programs that are designed specifically to improve outcomes in that area of healthcare. So for example, one project may focus on diabetes management, while another program may focus on maternal and child health. And they would have measurable outcomes that would be reported, and so they can demonstrate whether or not this change actually had an impact on improving outcomes rather. And if it did, then the Medicaid program would look to do a waiver with the federal government to allow us to implement that program system-wide because it was proven to be effective. So that's the whole notion of this. It's the first time the state has embarked on this data evidence-driven project pilot specific type of approach to really try to improve our health outcomes. This is the way they would do it in any other kind of a business setting. So I'm really excited that we're going to be doing that with Medicaid this year. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how the first year of the project goes. Next slide, please. This is the healthcare pillar of the Black Caucus pillars, HB 3840. It would create a Medicaid Managed Care Oversight Commission that would review the relationship with managed care companies and the Medicaid program. It would include a $50 million grant program to address maternal mortality. You may have seen there was an article in the Tribune a week ago again, on the stark disparities between maternal mortality and outcomes between different populations within the city, mothers of color versus white mothers, and the difference in the outcomes is really, it's stark from a statistical standpoint. And so this is going to be looking at addressing that. The article in the Tribune noted that Ingalls Hospital has created the first of its kind center to focus on maternal health and really trying to dive in there. It would include implicit bias training added to healthcare professional licensing programs. It would allow a healthcare employee to use sick time to care for their families. It would put a 2-month freeze on hospital closures. The concern there was that we had a couple of hospitals that were hinting at maybe closing while we're in the pandemic. And we really wanted to make sure that hospitals were not closing at a time when we never knew how many hospital beds we were going to have to access. So that's why they put a freeze on the hospital closures in the bill. And it would require all hospitals to provide adequate PPE to all of their staffs. The bill did pass the Senate. However, the version that passed the House had a technical error in it that we weren't able to fix in time that would have made it ineligible for federal matching funds. So we're going to have to go back and fix this in the 102nd General Assembly this spring. Next, please. And then seclusion rooms. This is a bill I've been working on for a year now. And it started from the article that the Tribune did with ProPublica, really highlighting the use of exclusion rooms, isolation rooms, and restraints on students in our public and private schools, and that they were being used for punishment rather than treatment. And there was several instances of abuse related to the use of these rooms. And so what this is a very comprehensive bill that we reached a lot of negotiation on with all the different stakeholders, and came to a bill that we finally got all groups agreeing to, that would ban prone restraints, which are the face down types of restraints. It would provide criteria for the use of all other kinds of restraints to make sure that they're being used for therapeutic purposes. It would ban locked isolation rooms. It would permit timeouts and supervised seclusion rooms. It would provide a 3-year time frame for the reduction and ultimate elimination of the use of isolation and restraints. It provides grants to schools for transitioning to the new tools that are available to replace isolation and restraints. This bill unanimously passed the Senate, so I'm very grateful to my colleagues in the Senate. Every one of them voted to support this bill and protect our students and our schools, especially the most vulnerable. The House unfortunately ran out of time, and so we are going to be reintroducing that and move it through in the 102nd General Assembly. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Representative Walker.
Thank you. Vote by mail is the next slide. I will report that we had a very good election this past cycle. And the reason we did was that so many, literally thousands of people worked on the election from both parties and independents as well. The reason our elections work so well in this state, and I think in most of the country, is because so many volunteers participate. And we found very little irregularities, and when we do, we correct them. The vote by mail extension is to take some of the changes we did because of the COVID pandemic in this past election and extend them in the future. They include establishing permanent voting drop boxes as an alternative. Election authorities must accept vote by mail ballots regardless of postage. But that means not necessarily the date, but by whether or not it has sufficient postage. Allows election authorities to establish curbside voting, as some people prefer, and it's something we're going to work on in the next election. We have a special committee just focusing on this issue. I think everyone of both parties wants a fair election, and they want the right people to vote, and they want access. So we're going to work on that. One thing I want to point out here is you'll see it allows election authorities, and it allows election authorities said twice, or election authorities must accept. Basically what we're doing is we're leaving the power of the election process in with local authorities, as has been traditional in the state, while establishing standards for them. And one of the reasons I'm proud of Illinois and I expect that we'll continue to have good elections is that so many local people are involved in them. And so if anything untoward happens, it gets quickly reported, and we have lawyers that look at it, and election authorities intervene. So we're going to keep a decentralized election system. We'll go to the next one. A lot of talk about education bill. Our House Bill 2170 is actually establishes some improvements to our curriculum and establishes the challenge of getting more teachers in general, but specifically more minority teachers in Illinois, because research has shown that minority students do well with minority teachers. And so one of the things that we noticed in reviewing all this was that some of the requirements that we have for our state universities are actually not requirements on our high schools. For instance, state universities for most admissions require a foreign language, and yet our high schools don't all offer them. So for the long term, we're establishing the foundation that our high schools actually link with our higher education so that the same requirements apply, and that people that need to meet those requirements in order to go to a state university actually can get them in the public high school curriculum. The reason the dates are long here, you'll see 2024 in one and 2829 in the other, is that these take a long time to develop. We're not really into just doing abrupt things in the education field. We need time to establish the curricula, to establish the tools for teachers to teach the teachers. Computer literacy has become a requirement for jobs. And so it's important. It's important in many ways. An inclusive history curriculum is another thing that we're looking at to require, that includes a broader sense of what the reality of America has been over time. And we continue to learn about that. We all do. And so we really have a responsibility to teach our high school kids as much as we can learn about our own history. Talked about minority teachers before, but one of the things most important, I think, to Ann and to me, is that we have a series of workforce development programs in high school and in our community colleges to do apprenticeships, to get training, to get licensure, to have transitions where people can go from high school to community college to a four-year university in order to get, for instance, nursing degrees or other similar, even finance degrees. We're gonna get together and consolidate all the workforce development programs into a single agency, so that rather than have everyone's great idea kind of going off on its own, we're trying to coordinate it all into one package. And I think in the future, as we figure out how to prepare people for jobs of the future, we're going to have a single agency to coordinate all the efforts in this area. If we go to the next one. Economic opportunity. I think it's clear to everyone that one of our top priorities, in addition to getting past our struggles with COVID and opening up our economy and opening up our schools and everything else, getting vaccinated, we really have to have a specific plans to build our economy back and to build it back better, to coin a phrase. But the things that came out of the Black Caucus pillar that we are working on and that we put in is that we're going to prohibit or the upfront rejection of applicants for jobs based on previous history, previous record. There are exceptions to this that are in the bill that allow for jobs that require bonding, of course, are exceptions to this. Jobs that have specific requirements in the job that might relate to a person's record could be exempt from this. But in general, what we're trying to prevent is the general process of people applying for jobs and then either a person or an artificial intelligence automatically disqualifying them from even consideration or even their resume being looked at because they have found something in their past, in their record, that automatically bumps them out of a population. If we're going to recover our economy, we need all the talent we can get. And if we're going to recover the way that we handle our prison system and our rehabilitation system, we have to have systems that don't automatically disqualify people from even consideration. It does the same thing with state businesses, that state businesses that are not committed to equal pay, and we'll measure that for all their populations that are protected under the Act, they won't get contracts anymore from the state for doing business. So that's really an enforcement mechanism. Senate Bill 1608 is about what's called Black enterprise. It's really for all protected classes, but it's it sets goals to diversify state contractors. State contractors in the past have had a lot of goals, and we've not been very good at measuring and enforcing those goals. So this will help with that. Another exciting part of this bill is the treasurer will create grant programs aimed at minority-owned businesses and aimed at rural businesses in areas that are economically deprived, let's say, where we have a lot in the state. We have a lot of opportunity in the state, but it's not always equally spread to areas that most need it. And so the treasurer is going to create grant programs aimed at minority-owned businesses and aimed at minority-owned entrepreneurial firms and even startup capital, venture capital firms. We're going to get into a new space that most people haven't done in the country, and we're going to lead in establishing minority-owned venture capital so that we can spread out the economic opportunity that exists in Illinois to a wider population. The Community Reinvestment Act was an act that was done in the 70s and then revised in the 80s and 90s to attack the issue of redlining. where we have communities, especially poorer communities and communities of color, that were arbitrarily prevented from getting mortgages and personal loans and business loans. We found in studying all the data in this that two things have happened since then, that the banking industry has completely changed, where we have such things as Quicken loans and mortgages and Rocket Mortgage, and we have people taking investments via the internet. So the structures of the Community Reinvestment Act, which was branch bank based, have to be revised. So we're gonna take a serious look at that to make sure that investments by the banking industry are spread around the entire state without being based entirely on where your branches are. So that's an update to that. 1 second. Trouble with my computer. Good. The Senate Bill 1792 creates Cannabis Equity Commission. We established the new cannabis proposition, the business propositions, and part of that was to try and help communities that were especially seriously harmed by the war on drugs over time, to gain some of the opportunity in the cannabis industry through how we issue licenses and how we establish businesses and who gets approval for locations, that kind of thing. We're taking another look at that and looking at an equity commission, because as it rolled out, it didn't really have the impact we had hoped it would have. Much of the industry is concentrated in areas that we weren't expecting. So we're going to take a look at that. Payday lenders, who we're going to establish protections against payday lenders that stop predatory lending, where people take advantage of desperate needs of loans and turn around and charge up to an average of over 800% interest. This is really a shocking industry when you look at it. And so we established a cap on interest rates for these short-term installment loans. This is not for banks, but for these smaller, independent, semi-independent branches that do payday loans of 36%, which historically is the old usury rate that we used to have before we did away with it. So we're trying to protect consumers with that. In terms of public housing applications, it's similar to what we're doing with jobs, that we want public housing to collect criminal histories of people, which they're required to do now, but it prohibits them from considering arrest records if there's no conviction, or if the expunged convictions should be expunged from those records when determining whether or not to rent or lease to someone. This is really trying to reach the communities, especially a perfect example are people that have served their time in prison and come out and look for housing and literally cannot get housing, even public housing, because of their record, just arbitrarily. And yet some of them have to have residence to get other benefits. So this is something that actually prevents that kind of homelessness that is forced upon people by the state based on their history. So why don't we go to the next slide? A lot of detail in this second opportunity. Go ahead. Criminal justice. This is a very substantial bill, and many people have talked about it. And I'm glad we're going to bring it up and get into it on detail, because in fact, much of what I heard, and we heard a lot about this bill as it was being negotiated from all our constituents. We heard a lot about the bill that actually turned out not to be in the bill in the end. There were things that were frightening at first in various drafts and proposals around the bill that we took the input from our constituents and our local police, for instance, and took out of the bill. And so what actually passed is, I think, fairly reasonable, the kind of thing that most people would support. And I think it will make us safer. actually. It's something well overdue. Why don't I turn it over to Ann and say how this process worked?
Okay, so the process for the criminal justice bill, there were a series of 9 public hearings that were held over the summer and fall. I'm not on the criminal justice committee, but I was able to attend those. They were made available to the public through the ILGA. And I'm just going to mention this because it's something to watch in the future. There's a website where you can see all the bills that have been introduced called ilga.gov. And there is on that homepage at ilga.gov, there is a video and audio. And if you click on that, if there's a hearing that's going to be made available through video, you can actually watch that hearing through that website. So this is particularly important as both houses are approving doing remote committee hearings until we can get fully back in session after the pandemic is over. So just remember that ilga.gov video is where you can watch the committee hearings that are taking place at any given day. So there were 9 hearings that were held and 30 different sets of groups that came in to, oh, and Austin just put that in the chat room, that came in to testify, including several law enforcement groups. So I know there's been a lot of confusion about that. I just want to read a list of the law enforcement groups that did testify. So the Illinois Association of Chiefs of Police, the State's Attorneys Association, the Illinois Department of Corrections, the Illinois State Police, the Illinois Probation and Court Services Association, the Illinois Sheriff's Association, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and the Police Benevolent and Protective Association. Those were all groups that testified in those 9 hearings. There were other groups that were also in private meetings with the sponsors of the bill and in the negotiations that went up. And negotiations kept going on right up until the last day. I know there was a lot of stories out there about how this bill was rushed through at the end, and we voted on it at 5:30 in the morning, and we did vote on it at 5:30 in the morning. However, there had been drafts of the bill available to legislators earlier. We all had an opportunity to read it. Many of the portions of the bill had actually been previously introduced over the last 2 years as individual bills, and they combined them into an omnibus. So the text of those bills has been available since 2019. And the reason why it was voted on so late were those negotiations that Mark mentioned that came that brought the bill to what the final version was. So I can tell you, for example, 2 of the provisions that were modified in that last night included the removal of the provision that was going to modify qualified immunity so that stays intact. Qualified immunity is still in existence. The bill does establish a task force to review the impacts of qualified immunity so that we can do a little more assessment of it, but it did not in any other way touch it. And it removed the provisions that took away collective bargaining rights or limited collective bargaining rights for police. There was the original bill had a provision in it that would have limited the ability of police to collectively bargain over certain topics, and those provisions were removed. The last thing that was also in there is there was a provision that if local police departments failed to comply with the body cam provisions of the bill, that a form of funding called the Local Government Distributive Fund, which is how we get to local governments their share of the income tax that the state collects, that could be withheld if they failed to comply with the body cam laws. Local governments, that's their key source of operating income, and they were very concerned about that being removed. And so that provision, that penalty was taken out of the bill. So the things that were negotiated at the end that required us to vote so early in the morning were things that were actually negotiated with police departments and with local government units. So these groups continued to be heard throughout the process right up until the very end. In addition, there were also several victims' rights groups that were heard. So with pretrial release, for example, that's the provisions. The bill does abolish cash bail. But what it does instead is it puts in place a system where a judge is going to look at the specifics of each case, including the defendant's history, the likelihood that they might cause harm to others, and allows for victims of crimes, particularly domestic violence, to be able to testify in these hearings when there's going to be a potential release of this individual. And if the individual has a history like that, then they will be held until the hearing can be heard for the judge to determine what kind of determination should be made. Either they stay in prison, they stay in jail during the pretrial phase, or they have some modified release where they're on an ankle bracelet or sent to a different type of retention facility, or they are released on their own recognizance. And so there's several different options that a court can use, and it's going to be specific to the facts. So while what that really does is mean that a person who has access to funds but is otherwise a dangerous individual is not going to be allowed to get out just because they have access to money. That's what the focus of all of this is. So as a result, we had several groups that represent domestic violence victims, including the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation, the Illinois Network for Pretrial Justice, the Network Advocating Against Domestic Violence, and others who came out in strong support for this, because that actually put in some provisions that they feel make victims of domestic and child abuse and sexual abuse safer. And they issued various press statements in support of it, and actually gave an example of a woman who ended up being killed because her husband was able to get access to funds to get out on bail, who would have been alive today if this new process had been in place at that time. So I go through all of that to let you know that this process, despite what some of the stories you may be hearing, actually was quite a lengthy process, involved input from a number of sources, had language available to legislators well before, and even the size of the bill. You've all heard it's a 700-page bill. In reality, the substantive provisions of that bill encompass 115 pages. The rest of it, here's a good example. You would not believe how many times the word bail appears in statutes in Illinois. And because we were changing it to pretrial release, they had to go through and change every statute where the word bail showed up and change it to pretrial release. And that must have taken up 200-300 pages by itself as I was reading through it. It was incredible how many times that showed up. So that's the background on it. What the bill does do, you've been able to see on the slide here while I've been talking, it does modernize our sentencing laws. So it allows for some shortening of sentencing based on an inmate's actions during their term. So if they've engaged in different kinds of programs that the Department of Corrections deems rehabilitative or educational, or in otherwise is preparing them for life after release, that they can get some credit against their sentence for that participation. If they agree to go into the Kiwani program, which is the work reentry program, the life reentry program, which I had an opportunity to tour, and is truly an amazing program where we're trying to get these inmates who've been in for long periods of time ready to be responsible citizens when they come out. And they go to Kiwani, they transition for the last 2 years of their sentence to go through all these different trainings. So they can have some, if they do the pre-work for that, they can have some reduction on their sentencing. That's what the sentencing law changes are. It does abolish cash bail, as we've talked about. It requires mandatory body cameras by 2025, and there's a phase-in program The Illinois Camera Grant Program will continue to provide some funding for local governments, and we have our ongoing negotiations to develop more funding sources for local governments to implement those cameras. And I should have said on cash bail, that program goes fully into effect January 1 of 2023, and it's going to be transitioning between now and then. It does include reforms to crowd control response. So if in a crowd control situation, different things that have to be considered before using pepper spray or other types of harmful tools to respond to crowds, prevents destruction of misconduct records. They have to be preserved. So that if there is a future question or if there's a determination that there's a potential pattern of behavior, the records will still be available. It increases de-escalation training and establishes use of force standards by 2022. One of the things that I think is really important there is you may have heard of a concept called deflection teams. And deflection teams are teams where you bring a combination of police with mental health professionals, psychologists, substance abuse professionals that go in to answer calls that may involve a mental health patient, may involve a domestic situation, where counseling and somebody who is trained to deal with people that are having crisis episodes are going with the police. So not only is there going to be joint training, but there's additional funding and support for creating these deflection teams, which are going to help our police. Because right now we send our police out into the situations where they have to deal with folks that are having mental breakdowns or having other kinds of crisis situations, and they don't have the training to deal with that. This is going to help them by giving them the resources for folks that do have that training that can go with them. It does not replace police, it does not defund police, but it gives them these additional resources to use when they're responding to calls. It does ban chokeholds. We had a partial ban on it in Illinois for several years now, and this legislation further clarifies the state's position on chokeholds. What the bill does not do, as I mentioned, it does not defund police. It does not modify or remove qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is a court established provision that says where a police officer is in a situation where someone thinks that they were hurt and they want to be able to sue the officer, but it's not a situation where there is clearly established law on what the officer was supposed to do, then that officer is immune from prosecution or civil liability in that situation because there wasn't clear directive to them beforehand. That's the concept of qualified immunity. The bill is not modifying or removing it. It is establishing a task force to determine what the impact of qualified immunity is and whether modifications would be appropriate at some point in the future. It does not change or take away collective bargaining rights, and it does not alter prison for serious crimes. So this is what the bill does and doesn't do. There's, we'd be happy to take questions on that, but we did want to be able to share with you what the process was that we did. And in case anybody's wondering, this is the full bill right here. And you can tell by the little tabs there, I actually did read the entire thing and made notes so that I'd be able to answer questions if you haven't. So with that, Austin, I will turn it back over to you. Oh, unless Mark, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, yeah, just one set of perspective. Although these are substantial bills with substantial changes, I think you'll notice as we go through them, we didn't just drop a cinder block on the floor. Almost everything that will take time, that will take training, that will take further study, or will take just a transition period, we set future dates. Mm-hmm. What we did was establish a foundation of where we wanted to be on these big issues, but clearly, for instance, with body cameras not fully implemented till 2025, some of the things till 2029, some others till 2022. So we established a foundation from which to build, but we want everyone to understand in the whole community of stakeholders, this is where we're going, so that we can work getting from here to there.
Mhm. Austin?
Sure. Great. Well, thank you, Senator and Representative. There on your screen, you can see our contact information for both of our offices. We'll transition now to the question and answer portion of the town hall this evening. A couple housekeeping things up at the top here. Some of the questions that we've received are things that'll be better handled with direct follow-up. So if you don't hear your question answered tonight in this forum, know that we'll likely be reaching out to kind of settle that. And also, there are a number of similar questions, so we'll try and group them together, topic-oriented. And obviously, as we mentioned a couple times in the chat, if you have any questions from the presentation that you haven't already submitted, feel free to do those in the chat and we'll get to them towards the end. So we will start off then with a couple questions about the climate and the environment. So a couple folks have asked if you have an update on the Clean Energy Jobs Act on CEJA, what we might expect about it, if there's any discussion for when it might come up in this General Assembly.
Actually, I got notice today there's going to be a press conference at 10 a.m. tomorrow on the reintroduction of CEJA. So tune in to your local TV station tomorrow and you'll hear more details, but it is being reintroduced.
Yeah, it's going to be a Facebook stream on IL Clean Energy Facebook site at 10 a.m. I'm a sponsor of the bill. I expect that we will reintroduce it. We just have to get it through. The reason I'm so excited about it is not only because we have to save the planet, but it also produces immediate jobs and immediate payback. It's one of the few bills I've seen, and I've heard a lot over the years, that actually does produce demonstrable jobs in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're gonna see what happens, and you'll hear more about it tomorrow.
And I'm also a co-sponsor on the bill as well. This is something that both Mark and I feel very strongly about.
Great. In the same vein, a constituent asked, how can we make our communities more sustainable? Things like promoting less driving and making folks more aware of what actions they can take to help the environment.
Well, you know, one of the things that I really liked about the capital funding bill that we did last year is we included a sizable portion that was set aside for public transportation and other kinds of sustainability initiatives that would focus on money for local communities to create bike lanes, to do different kinds of expand rail, local buses, make them more environmentally friendly, clean energy buses. So that's the kind of thing that is in that capital bill that I think is really going to go a long way to helping communities be able to fund the projects that they'd like to do for the communities.
Let me just add that I'm guessing that the person that asked that question is already an activist in this area. But there's a lot that each of us can do with our own villages to push clean energy practices, to push, saving the use of electricity, changing how roads are used, bike lanes, all that kind of thing is often done at the local level. And I would, if you want to really make a change, we'll push it at the state level, but volunteering or being an activist at the local level to your own village or park district is an important thing too.
Great. We'll shift gears a little bit onto some questions about the COVID pandemic. We had a couple of folks asked about seniors and older individuals. One question says, during this pandemic, older individuals, especially those who live in assisted care or long-term care facilities, as well as those in hospitals, have experienced social isolation from their loved ones. Can the state exert any influence to encourage change of approaches, things that would maybe allow for more visitation, things of that nature?
The state has been doing inspections of nursing home facilities. to ensure that the protocols are appropriate and that the state guidelines are being followed. But other than that, you know, the reason for the restriction on visitors is the same thing they're doing in acute care hospitals, the same thing that we're all doing at home with our staying at home and staying in your safe pod. And that's to try to limit the exposure to different vulnerable individuals by limiting the number of people that you're in contact with, unfortunately. One of the things that I got to experience that firsthand. I had knee surgery a few days before Christmas, and my family literally dropped me off at the door, and I didn't see them until everything was all over, and they were able to pick me up. So it's unfortunately the world we live in right now. But I know that we want to be able to open up facilities as soon as we can, and that is a concern. It's one of the reasons why those facilities were placed high up on the list for vaccination. So I'm hopeful that as the population in the state becomes more and more vaccinated, that some of those restrictions will be able to be eased. I know it's very painful for families.
Yeah, so we'll move on to our next question for COVID. Thank you, Senator Gillespie, for that response. What's the plan for opening the world back up? Any idea how much longer we might have to stay inside?
Well, let me take a shot at that. I think, you know, I'm no fortune teller, but I think it all depends on, as it always has, our rate of infection and the rate of the spread and how fast we can get vaccines out. I think everyone understands that. I think the only thing that we all fear now is whether there are new strains of the virus that will throw off our plans. And so I would just be guessing. I know the more we vaccinate, the more we follow the guidelines, the more the numbers keep coming down, and the more we'll open up. I noticed we got mostly into basketball, for instance, and now we're going to go more into school openings. We'll be opening businesses a little more, but again, with those and with the new COVID strains, if the numbers go up again, then we're in a world of hurt. So we'll just have to see. You know, I know there's a lot of frustration and there's a lot of confusion as well, but I do like the approach that we let what is going on in the environment determine what our next steps are. And what's going on in the environment as measured by things like hospitalizations and testing and how many people are vaccinated. There are other perspectives on it, I understand, and it's very difficult to weigh the risks and weigh the impacts and weigh the psychological impacts, for instance, of a person in a nursing home who is isolated. Those are all important things. But and we have to weigh them all. And in fact, people are weighing them all, but I still am going to look at the numbers to see how fast we can get out of this.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I want to thank our community here for this has been particularly rough on local businesses and restaurants. And the community has done so much to step up with taking carry out to support local community. I want to thank our businesses who have followed the guidelines and done what they can to keep their environments and their customers safe. And I just thank the community for your support of local businesses, your adherence to the guidelines. This is what's helping us get back to stage 4 and will help us be able to open all that much sooner. So thank you.
Kind of stay in the ballpark, but transition to vaccines. We had quite a number of questions come in about vaccines and the availability, almost all of them about those 2 questions. So I think this first one sums up a lot of the other comments that we got and questions we got on vaccines. What is the state doing to improve the vaccine rollout and provide some certainty to those waiting for the vaccine? It's very frustrating to not be able to even reach a site to try and obtain an appointment. And kind of a follow-up with there, when do we expect that vaccines will be more available here in Illinois?
So let me tell you about how it's working right now first. The Department of Public Health, the Illinois Department of Public Health, receives about a 48-hour notice from the federal government of how much vaccine they're going to get in a given week. So usually on Tuesdays, the federal government will notify the state how much they expect to send the state on Thursday. So that gives the state 2 days to let the local authorities, the pharmacies, know what they're going to get in terms of supply, which is part of the reason why you have such a hard time getting appointments, because that gives them 2 days to figure out how many appointments they can add to the schedule, which then gives you the opportunity to sign up for appointments. And that's why it looks like there isn't anything. And then all of a sudden, some appointments will open up and then they'll get closed right away, because that's how the distribution of vaccine is coming to us. Now that should stabilize some as the federal government has implemented the Defense Production Act, is trying to stabilize and provide a more routine, regular supply of vaccine. We should be able to improve that. But that's the framework that the state and local health departments have had to operate in during this whole time. And then there's the whole difficulty of the first dose versus reserving for the second dose. And what some local departments were doing was reserving at the beginning. So every time they gave somebody a first dose, they would set aside a second dose for 21 days until that person would be due for their second dose. And what the state went in and said is a couple of weeks ago, it said, don't do that anymore, because you're holding it in reserve for too long. We could be inoculating a lot more people during that time, and you can use future shipments as they come in to cover the second dose, but we could get more people with at least partial protection through a first dose if we stop that practice. So the state has begun redistributing where a local area has a big reserve. They started to redistribute some of that to areas that didn't, or were being more efficient in it, and really advise local departments to not hold reserves for 21 days, to hold them for a shorter period of time, and to use the supplies as they come in to fill those second dose as well as additional first doses. So there's been some adjustment in how we distribute the doses as they come in over the last few weeks. So that should also help with improving the way this is done as well.
Let me just add that we're as frustrated as you are. And I personally am frustrated. I just bent Austin's ear yesterday yelling at him about vaccines because I'm of an age and have underlying conditions that I was eligible a while ago, and I've struggled trying to get any information at all. So I think as we go along, I know there's a lot of pressure on the Department of Health and the governor to try and straighten this out. Some of the things they're doing are opening up bigger vaccination centers with the help of the National Guard. And as supplies come, there'll be wider distribution. You'll notice that the Cook County suburban site has a new website that they're going to combine all the signups to. That those of you who have signed up to other things like the CVS system or the old Cook County site or the state site, they're directing you to this new site to go in the next couple of days. Maybe that will straighten out, at least get rid of the duplication, straighten out the process. And I'm hoping that in the end, they can figure out a way to have some kind of waiting list so you know where you are. Because your requests are dated, but there's no confidence that the oldest dated requests are actually the first ones responded to. So I'm looking forward to some improvements, and I certainly personally am as frustrated as all of us. Now, on the other hand, there are other challenges. There are people that don't use computers. There are people that are stuck in their homes for real. And we're trying to establish models with the same pharmacy chains that are delivering to the assisted living and the healthcare facilities for the elderly to somehow figure out with us how to get to others who are homebound. But that's in development now.
Similar to your response, just in Representative Walker, we did have somebody ask about seniors and marginalized communities. What can private citizens do to help encourage folks to get vaccinated?
Oh, I'm not sure why the word encourage is there. How private citizens could help people get vaccinated. I think the number one thing to do right now is, frankly, to help them get into the systems, to make contact with them and sign them up if they don't know how to sign up, and keep up on the messaging for them. Beyond that, as other systems get developed, I would just stay in contact. Now, the word encourage brings up an interesting thing. One of the challenges has been healthcare workers, even first responders, not being among the first to actually accept the vaccine when it's offered to them. Hopefully, that's an issue that's going away. But we're not gonna get out of this as quickly as we can if we have that kind of hesitancy among our people that are actually distributing vaccines.
Great. And the last one we'll have on vaccines here about restaurant workers. When are they able to get vaccinated? The question says they've been working throughout this pandemic and should be considered frontline workers, just like grocery store workers. Many restaurant workers are anxious and exhausted. Any movement there?
Are restaurant workers 1C?
We'd have to follow up on that. I actually don't know off the top of my head. I don't know.
They're partial. Some will fall into 1B, Mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure which is. I know, because I do know some restaurant workers are getting vaccines and some apparently aren't. The challenge we have now, and we'll look into it for you and get back to you. Challenge we have now is that even with the people solidly in 1B, we have less than something like a third of them having available vaccines even now if all were distributed. So it's going to be a few weeks before we get through that population.
And I also wanted to mention quick, there is a new program the state has started, the COVID-19 Ambassadors Program. So those of you that want to help spread the word about vaccinations and to help those who are nervous or concerned about vaccinations, to talk with them and help people get vaccinated, there is a program where the state will train you to go out and talk about the program. There's a place to sign up for it. Jack, I don't know if you can post that, but you just complete a simple survey, and then you get notified about the training. They're estimating a monthly time commitment of 1 to 2 hours to be an ambassador. And you would, the responsibilities include proactively and on an ongoing basis promote the vaccines in their community, commend individuals who are practicing public health measures, provide input in the development of messaging and outreach materials, organize and implement virtual outreach activities such as a Facebook event, and share your success with the department so that they can improve on their communication skills. So anybody that would like to get involved in that program, the sign up information was just put in the chat function, and we'd really encourage you to get involved with the Ambassador Program.
Great. All right, we'll move on next to criminal justice reform, another area we had quite a number of questions on. Some of them I think were probably answered by the presentation, so we're going to touch on at least the ones that weren't. But starting first with a question about wanting to know, does Illinois have a center in each jail or some centralized center where each prisoner ready to end their sentence, or can get a prisoner ready to end their sentence and leave jail, like get resources like job counseling, an ID card, housing info, any other kind of assistance for them when they leave. The constituent believes that we need an overhaul of the jail by offering classes to good paying jobs and things like that. So.
Yeah. Each of the prisons has some level of support, but it can vary significantly from prison to prison. I've had the opportunity to tour 3 facilities so far, Stateville and Joliet, Logan Women's Correctional Center, and the Kewanee Center. The Kewanee Reentry Center is the place that has the most comprehensive set of reentry programs, as I mentioned earlier. It's a 2-year program. You get transferred there when you have 2 years left on your sentence, and you go through some extensive counseling. You go through mental health and substance abuse counseling, if that's appropriate. You receive job training, you receive other educational support, you receive life skills like doing your own laundry and cleaning and different things like that. They have the prisoners in these little pods that are like, they're like college dorms, and each one has its own little kitchen, each one has its own laundry facility, so they cook for themselves, they do laundry, and it's all trying to teach them those life skills, job interviewing skills, in addition to career and technical education type training for specific jobs. So the Kewanee Center is the place where the most intensive the program is. If the Kewanee Center has been around for a couple of years now, and they're hoping that we can at some point get funding to try to extend that to other parts of the system, or to duplicate it, create separate centers so it's not just all focused in the Kewanee area, but we can get other reentry. So that's what's available today, and we're real hopeful. As Mark mentioned earlier, he and I share a passion for career and technical education and apprenticeships. And that is something I've been talking with the Department of Corrections to see how we might be able to help expand some of those programs to the reentry population.
Yeah, there are other opportunities as well. And I can just give a personal opinion. I've often thought over the years that our correction system, while it's functional, I'd categorize it as a disgrace. We have the most people in jail of any modern society in the world, and we have among the least availability for actual rehabilitation. And why we do that to ourselves, I don't know, but we have to fix it. One of the things I've looked at in addition to job training is that we fund and we support, and we're great believers in community colleges. And I think part of the community college charter from the state ought to be to help our penal institutions to help people get prepared to leave and to come into society. Some of the things you saw in the Black Caucus pillars about being able to find places to live, being able to find jobs, being treated reasonably and fairly based on what their actual history is, as opposed to arbitrarily disqualifying themselves from housing or jobs or other training, are part of the things that we're doing. But it's going to be a big, comprehensive, multi-year task to reform our criminal justice system. Number one, so that it's just, but number two, so that it in fact has a rehabilitation factor to it for people that are available to that and willing to come out and be better members of society.
Great. We got quite a few more, so we'll try and push through here. I'm going to combine two that kind of touch on similar things in the criminal justice reform bill, specifically asking about what the bill does for the militarization of police, Illinois' documented history of coerced confessions, and also a separate one that mentioned the piece in the bill about ending the practice of suspending driver's licenses because of unpaid tickets. I don't know if you wanted to touch on any of those.
Sure. The bill does include provisions regarding the use of military equipment. It limits what local police departments can purchase through those programs. Hold on one second while I get that. It limits the, that you can't buy, some of the stuff you wouldn't think you'd have to say, but you can't purchase grenade launchers. You can't purchase bayonets. You can't purchase tanks, different things like that. So it does limit what you can purchase now to try to demilitarize a little bit the police forces. What was the other part of the question?
Yeah, militarization, coerced confessions, and ending the suspension of driver's licenses because of tickets.
Okay. It does end the suspension of driver's licenses because of unpaid fines. The rationale for that is it prevents people from being able to work, and they have to be able to earn money in order to pay the fine to begin with. So if you take away their license, it's going to limit, particularly out in the suburbs and in the rural areas, it's going to limit their ability to work significantly. It also addresses the I'm sorry, Austin, one more time.
For coerced confessions.
Coerced confessions, thank you. It limits the, what it does is looks at patterns of behavior. So it looks at, rather than isolated instances, if the Attorney General discerns that there's a pattern of behavior in a police department that sees repetitive coerced confessions or things like you saw years ago in the Chicago Police Department, it would allow the Attorney General to bring a civil action, to investigate and to bring a civil action as appropriate, to stop that behavior, stop that pattern from continuing. And so the approach that it takes is, rather than going after individual police officers, it looks for that pattern over in a course of a department so that it's a systemic issue. And that's when the Attorney General would go in and do something.
Great. The next one, how will the state hold organizations accountable to the new, to welcome the new standards established under the Pretrial Fairness Act and the other elements of HB 3653? So enforcement, it looks like a little bit.
Well, let me try and respond. I read that question. I thought it was a really interesting question because it asks how we can help the organizations welcome these things. I think that has to do with communications that, you know, we often talk to police organizations who will say that the people that most want good police and dislike bad police are police organizations themselves. So I think we're trying to figure out ways to do that without disrupting the camaraderie and the culture itself. We did take, and I might be the person who did this in the House, was to take out the LGDF penalty, because I thought that was too harsh a penalty to remove funding from someone who needed funding to fulfill a requirement that we required. But I think as we get into better training standards, better standards for operations, better use of force standards and training, I think the departments and the organizations will mostly come around. On the pre-trial issue, it's going to be a process over the next 2 years of determining how best to rate and rank, along with the judicial system, safety. The whole idea of this bail reform is to say that we're going to judge whether or not someone is detained before trial based on safety, public safety, more than on whether or not they can pay something, because that's fundamentally unfair. It's also unrelated to safety. And so if safety is your issue, this is actually a step in the right direction, but it's going to take a couple of years to develop the right standards that judges can use and prosecutors and defense attorneys can become familiar with to determine what are the standards for safety that allow someone to be released or not, and simply take money out of the formula. I think people will come around to it.
Great. Someone had a question about, I assume, the question is what is happening with HB 3653? I assume maybe it's a status update there, but
Which one is it?
the Criminal Justice Reform Bill, yeah, 3653.
I thought it was, yeah, it's had a couple numbers.
Yes.
I don't know. You know, a lot of people are lobbying and a lot of people are pressuring and a lot of people are calling and a lot of people are having press conferences. And my guess, it's just a guess, is that the governor will sign it and we will work on establishing these standards over time. Because again, if you look at it, the things are really established between the end of 22 through 29. I mean, we established the goal, the objective, the base, and we're going to establish the rules as we go along. That's what I expect. Now, if he vetoes it or does some kind of pocket veto, we'll see. We'll see. I would hope that our votes will be sufficient to override a veto, but if not, we'll look at what happens. No one wants to be unreasonable with the thing. But the truth is that I personally and many people believe it are steps in the right direction, and will take time to develop.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Still on criminal justice, would like to know how you feel about crisis response teams for mental health calls. Senator Gillespie, I think you touched on this a little bit already, but would you change our current system if you could, and what would you advocate for?
Well, I think what they've put in the bill with enhancing deflection teams is exactly what I would advocate for and where I'm hoping they would go. That they would pair up police with health professionals to answer these calls, because the risk of sending a health professional team out specifically is you don't know what the full situation is but until you get there, and you don't know if there's a crime involved that really would require police to be there. And likewise, when you're sending police into a domestic situation, you don't know if there's a mental health issue or a substance abuse issue that needs to be addressed. So pairing them up, I think, is definitely the right way to go. What I like about what's in the bill is it provides a set of training, it provides funding for that training, and it will phase it in over time so that these deflection teams will grow and be used by more departments over the course of the implementation period.
Let me add that over time, a lot of the local departments have done pretty well in this, but they've had different structures. I can recall that Rolling Meadows did extremely well with a professional social worker that focused on the Hispanic community and domestic violence. There's been some very good training and support for people dealing with mental health and disability issues with the Mount Prospect Police Department. And I know we just had a great experience that made the newspaper with the Arlington Heights Police Department. So the police are for this. It's a matter of what is the best structure and what's the best funding for it. The police officers I've talked to don't like these calls. And they know that they're dangerous, and probably would like someone along with them who's specially trained to just handle this kind of difficult situation.
Right. Last one we'll touch on for criminal justice. There were a couple more that look like they better direct follow-up. So last one we'll ask on the topic. How does the new criminal justice bill help the suburbs?
The whole notion of the deflection teams, I think, is definitely something that will be of use in the suburbs. The pretrial release, I think, is going to make for a safer environment for everybody, because it allows, as I mentioned earlier, it allows judges to take the totality of circumstances, whether guns were used in the crime, whether there's a history, whether there's a protective order against this individual that someone needs to be made aware of. and protected from, what the age of the victim is an issue depending on what the crime is. So there's a whole list of factors that the judge is to take into consideration when making the determination of whether to release somebody or put them into a different kind of retention. So I think that will make it safer for all of us across the burbs, because now just because somebody can get to money doesn't mean that somebody unsafe is going to be out on the street just because they were able to get bail. So I think that's an important thing for the suburbs as well. I think that the body cams issue is a universal issue. I like the fact that it's phasing it in to give the departments time to roll it out and give us opportunity to work on more funding support as we put these, as we roll these requirements out over the course of the next 3-4 years.
Great. Okay, we'll move on then to another hot topic in Illinois these days, ethics reform. We had a couple questions on that. First of all, would like to know what laws are being written to limit leaders' terms of office, limit on how much time a bill can be in the Rules Committee, and talks about setting up maybe more limits to the Speaker of the House's power, appointing committee chairs, things like that. So.
Let me deal with that.
Yeah.
That's because there is a new bill that was filed today that changes some of the House rules that came out of negotiations between the Democrats and the Republicans with the new speaker on what things we wanted to change. It includes a term limit for leaders, including the speaker. It includes the requirement that bills come out of the Rules Committee in a given period of time unless the sponsor wants them to stay in the Rules Committee. It does a lot of things like that you asked. We could probably get a copy of it for whoever asked that question. This is kind of inside baseball. But it doesn't do some things that are still being discussed. I mean, some of the initial feedback was, well, it did A, B, and C, but it didn't do D, G, E, and F. The reality is we have a whole list of things we're still negotiating with the Republicans that we're both trying to figure out exactly what to do to make sure the process works and is not bound up. And I'll just give you a short example that I often use with my colleagues. Everyone wants their bills to come out of committee, and everyone believes they have the best possible bill on earth, and therefore, because they're so smart, and therefore they all should get to the floor and get read 3 times and voted on. But that's all a given. But the reality is we have 6,000 bills filed every session. 6,000. There aren't enough minutes in the year for them all to go through the entire process. So there has to be some sorting through. Those are the kinds of things that we're really looking at. How do we handle so many ideas when really we only have maybe 100 key bills besides appropriations bills a year that are worth changing the law of the state of Illinois for? So there's some solutions we're trying to work through. Now, one of them is what just happened with the pillars of the Black Caucus, where you form omnibus bills with a lot of different ideas in them. The criminal justice bill itself combined 9 extant bills and added more language besides. Similarly, the economic development bills. If we ever do, which I hope we do, because Ann and I are working on it, a property tax reform bill, it's going to be a combination of at least a dozen previously filed bills. So if we can work out a consolidation process, then consolidated bills should move through and we don't get hung up with handling volumes. It's purely a volume, everyone wants their bills out and everyone wants to change the rules, but add to the formula 6,000 bills, then you realize that it's not all that straightforward.
Yeah, thank you. The next one, Senator Gillespie, will toss it to you. What will your first steps be on the state Senate Ethics Committee?
Yes, for those of you that aren't aware, the Senate established an ethics committee, and I've been asked to chair that committee, which I'm honored to do and looking forward to getting started. What we're going to focus on in the first place, I think this is going to be a multi-year process. I think that what we want to focus on this first year is the kinds of issues that gave rise to the ComEd and other scandals we've seen over the last couple of years. So things like restricting the use of so-called consultants, which is a loophole around the lobbying registration, which means these folks can operate under the radar. We want to get a lot more transparency into that. Some type of a revolving door, some more details required in the statement of economic interest that legislators have to file, a variety of things that focus on the specific abuses we've seen in the last couple of years and try to turn those off. And then I imagine there will be other things that will come up as well. So what I want to convey is that this isn't going to be a one and done. This is going to be something where we're going to try to put a good package through this year and then continue to look at where we can continually improve the situation.
Great, excellent. So I just want to note we're technically about 7 minutes out from our scheduled end time, but the Zoom set up to go until 8:30. So I want to get to a couple of budget and revenue questions because those are also the hot ones, and then maybe Representative and Senator if you want to keep going for a little bit. If folks are going to stick around, maybe we have that option as well. But first, we had a couple questions on the state budget, specifically on the revenue, what the fiscal plans are to address the state budget issues, and also maybe what we can or may not expect from the federal government to help out with the budget.
Yeah, let me take a shot at it. I mean, you all know as much as I do about what the relief from the federal government looks like. It looks like the Democrats are going to push it through the House and the Senate. It looks like we're going to get relief for the state government, for our COVID relief efforts, and for individuals. None of that is absolutely in stone yet, but it looks like we'll get there certainly within the next 2 weeks, is my guess. The state budget, our worst case forecast for a full year period because of this COVID disaster is that we were short about $4 billion in the state budget on a $30 billion plus budget. It now looks like the economy has not done quite as badly as that, although a lot of people are suffering. In fact, a lot of people still buy, and we have sales tax revenue, and a lot of people are still employed, and we have some of that. So it looks like we're going to be maybe 2 billion short, which is a big piece. The governor's come forth with saves that I think we're going to see in his budget address within the next 2 weeks of roughly $1 billion, maybe more. There are other issues going on. I think it remains to be seen. You know, we didn't get the fair tax. We're probably not going to change income tax. There is a chance that we will expand what things are covered by sales taxes. But every time we bring up a tax issue where, you know, that it's like automatically everyone's against it. So the chance of getting revenue that way is always slight. I think we'll have substantial cuts across the board anyway, regardless, because the hole is so big. And we'll just have to see. I know we're going to be working on it very hard for the next 3 months.
All right, and piggybacking off of that, a couple questions about pensions, specifically about pension reform, and if either of you support a constitutional amendment for pension reform.
So here's the thing with that. It focuses the issue. It diverts the focus from what the real problem is. So we could pass a constitutional amendment tomorrow on that, and it would not do one thing to solve the problem we're facing today. My preference is that we work on things that are actual solutions to the real problems. And the real problem today is that there are liabilities under the pension program that were accrued over the last 30 years that are not going to go away by doing a constitutional amendment, because you can't go backwards and because they are parts of labor contracts in addition. So even if you took away that constitutional amendment, you can't take away what's in the labor contract. So these are things that are going to have to be paid out to the folks that are already retired, the folks that are under the Tier 1 pension program. And so the only solution is to make the payments to try to get the program where it's supposed to be in terms of funding. And then to make sure that we don't not fund every time we don't fund the program, we incur more interest liability for ourselves. We incur more need to go out and get additional sources that will charge interest on it. So we need to be funding the program on a regular basis. We need to look at reamortizing, like you would with the mortgage. If you've got a balloon payment on a mortgage that you can't afford, your first thing is to reamortize that mortgage, to refinance it. And that's what we need to do with the pension liabilities that no constitutional amendment is going to change. In 2011, Representative Walker was a part of this. We passed the Tier 2 pension reform, and over 40% of state employees and teachers are now under that Tier 2 pension program. The Tier 2 pension is much less rich than the Tier 1 program was. In fact, every year we have to do an analysis to make sure that the Tier 2 program hasn't dipped below the level of Social Security, which would require us to have to pay Social Security under federal law, which would add to the burden as opposed to reducing the burden. So as the population continues to grow under the Tier 2, every employee brought into the state after 2011, from 2011 on, is automatically under that Tier 2. And that's about as low as you can go without going to Social Security. So even if you switch to a defined contribution program, it's not going to be any cheaper than what you could do under Tier 2, because if you do anything less than what's in Tier 2, the federal law requires you to pay Social Security, which is the equivalent of what that benefit would be. So the whole notion of we want to go to defined contribution versus defined benefit isn't a solution, and it's not necessarily cheaper if it triggers a Social Security requirement. And going to the constitutional amendment doesn't solve any of the liabilities we currently face right now today. So we need to focus on what's going to solve the problem today. And from my perspective, that's reamortization and continuing with the Tier 2 program. Mark, I don't know if you want to add anything.
That was perfect. Yeah, I was part of the pension reform initially that created the Tier 2 pension, and also tried to do things with medical expenses and automatic cost increases that were part of the labor contract that got overturned by the Supreme Court. And there are some people that believe if we did a constitutional amendment, at least we could take some of the growth factors, tamp them down. Other people believe it wouldn't make any difference because those are part of the original labor contract anyway, and we have the US Constitution contract clause to contend with. In any case, that's not the bulk of the problem. The bulk of the problem is, as you said, we have to pay them down. I will say that since the second year of Blagojevich, we've made the pension payment every year. And I expect we will again, no matter how much it costs us to cut other programs, because we really don't have a very good option, not an alternative, as far as I understand it.
All right, that was our last one, revenue and pensions. Thank you for that. We'll transition real quickly to fair maps. A couple of people asked about redistricting, specifically about if there will be new fair maps, but also with the latest development that the census will be delayed. Will that have any impact on what a new map will look like?
Let me take a shot. It will have an impact that the census is delayed. Whether it'll have an impact on who gets to draw the map is unclear, because the Constitution requires us to draw a map by a given date. And it makes there's no adjustment in that language for what if we don't get the census on time. Some people believe we can just extend the date by legislation or rule. Other people believe that we automatically fall into another category where, God knows, we either negotiated or someone pulls something out of a top hat. It remains to be seen. I just don't know the answer. As far as getting a fair map, the new speaker and the governor have committed to a fair map. But of course, everyone's definition of a fair map might be different. But at least there's a concept to work towards. And we're discussing ways that we can judge maps' fairness. One of the things that's most interesting to me, I've been looking at this for over a year. Some of the maps drawn last time by independent commissions turned out to be less fair than the maps that were drawn by state legislatures for various reasons. When you look at the metrics of fairness that are typically brought up in court cases about mapping. So establishing a standard by which we can judge the extent to which a metric that says our map is fair politically, it's very tricky, but it's something we have to work on so that people can get some comfort. It's a funny kind of situation, because people automatically assume the worst of politicians, and therefore any map drawn by a politician is automatically wrong and bad and unfair. If you apply third-party metrics and mathematical metrics to it on how well it predicts outcomes of elections, you'll find there's a whole range of outcomes from mapping, and by hook or by crook, I don't know. Illinois is one of the fairest maps in the country now. Not to say gerrymandering doesn't exist, but in other states, it's much, much worse when you look at the actual third-party mathematical metrics. Other states produce horrendous legislatures versus what their populations would call for in different political parties or affiliations. So establishing a standard on what is fairness is important. I will say one of the reasons we came out as well as we did, despite people's perceptions, is that Kwame Raoul was in charge of the mapping in 2010 as a senator, and he had a great series of standards he applied to the map that the legislature applied to itself when producing the map. And he actually produced a map that, by third-party metrics, over time turned out to be relatively fair relative to the other states. So we'll see.
Great. We'll transition quickly to two questions relating to guns, but not all of them gun control. The first one, constituent curious if you can give an update on the FOID system, which has obviously had a lot of delays. So.
I don't know. I have, the sponsors have not refiled it yet. I have heard some discussion that it may be refiled in a different form. So I think that's still an open issue. I'm hoping that something will get filed.
Great. Then we'll transition to the gun control question. What is your position on firearms, and what do you consider is an assault weapon?
Mark, I'm going to let you take that one as the professional here.
I'm not a professional by any means.
You've had more experience with it than I have.
Yeah, when I was in Vietnam in the field, I carried my M16 on semi-automatic because I found, and most of my peers found in the field, that semi-automatic was a better killing weapon than a fully automatic M16. Now the AR-15 was designed for the military to be used in close combat. It is not designed to protect your house. It is not, I mean, it's fine, I guess, for target practice if you like the noise. But I view a semi-automatic M16 style weapon as a weapon of war designed to kill people in specific situations. And I personally don't believe it's an appropriate weapon to be extant in our society. That's my personal view from my own personal experience. In general, though, I grew up with guns in my household. I have no problem with guns in general. I think that there are a lot of things we could do as far as registration goes and tracking guns. I think that people who have guns should be liable as people who drive cars for the harm that their guns do. And that liability could extend to the manufacturers as they do with cars and airplanes and other tools. There are things we can do to make our society safer. So I'm not fundamentally against guns. I do believe an AR-15, any Armalite, or any Colt that's designed for close combat, formed that way, that has .223 rounds that are designed to kill and be very difficult to extract from a human body, for instance. I don't know what people are thinking, to tell you the truth. When I left Vietnam, I put that kind of weapon down on the ground and I will never pick it up again. And I think that for me personally, that's a moral decision.
I certainly appreciate that response. Thank you, Representative. Nearing the end here, there are a couple questions about unemployment, specifically what's being done to address the fraudulent cases that have been going through IDES.
You know, that's a national issue. It started at the federal level and infiltrated down to the state level. And so I know the state is working with other states and the federal government to try to stop it at its source. If you have received a notification that your identification was used to file a claim, please contact IDES so they are aware of the situation. A lot of times people are getting notified of this from their employer, and that's because the IDES reaches out to the employer to confirm that you're no longer employed. And that's the first notification that it's happened. So please make sure that you inform IDES. If you haven't heard back from them, a resolution on it, don't be concerned, because as I said, this is a national problem and all the states are trying to coordinate with the federal government on resolving it.
All right, then we'll close out with two questions that I think are kind of similar, so we'll wrap them together. First one is, what is the status of Senator Gillespie's proposed affordable housing legislation? But I think we'll tuck it into close with, what are your goals for this session? And the constituent also added, thank you for all that you're doing. So.
Okay. All right, my affordable housing legislation, I just had a meeting on that today. I am going to reintroduce the bill. It's currently in our Legislative Reference Bureau getting drafted as we speak. I'm looking to coordinate again with Senators Maddie Hunter and Sarah Feigenholtz, who each had different variations on affordable housing. We're trying to put it together in an omnibus comprehensive package to address affordable housing at different levels. And so we're going to be continuing to focus on that in this General Assembly. In addition to that, as I mentioned, I'm going to reintroduce the seclusion bill. I'm going to try to get that resolved this year. I will be working on ethics reform, as we talked about. I am also going to be working, I did some work on social work legislation, trying to provide different incentives to get more social workers out into our schools and into our Department of Corrections areas. So we're going to try to get those through this year. They got put on hold given the COVID situation last year. So those are some of the main things that I'll be focusing on, in addition to things that the General Assembly in general will be focusing on, the budget, and continuation on the healthcare reform issues.
I'll jump in, and I've been focusing on economic development and economic recovery with a slant to it. If you look at the state's performance over the past decade or so, some of the real creative and interesting and well-funded programs for economic development have gone to the largest corporations in Illinois, and often that money produced almost nothing that wouldn't have already happened. For instance, millions of dollars to Sears, to Baxter, to Allstate, to Caterpillar. It looks like that many of the things they did, they would have done either way. So I have been working very diligently, going through all the programs we have and figuring out ways that at least some of those resources and skills can be applied to small businesses, to Main Street businesses, to businesses that actually grow, as opposed to ones that are already mature and already trying to figure out ways to get more efficient and therefore cut jobs. I'm going to focus on the growth areas of our economy. And so that requires changing the rules, changing the selection processes, changing the scoring processes, changing the allocation of funding. I'm also deep into establishing new venture capital efforts that focus on small businesses and communities, the poor communities, including rural communities, areas that we've naturally in this environment have tended to go away from because some of the biggest powers and the biggest donors in the state are the largest. And I think the growth in the state will come from the smallest. So that's where I'm going to focus. I'm also the chair of the Financial Institutions Committee in the House, which I'm delighted with, because we're going to focus on establishing new reinvestment and investment standards for all the industries, all the financial industries in Illinois, including credit unions, banks, payday lenders, as we talked about before. All of that's going to be in my purview. And I definitely look forward to it. I think, like many of the social and justice issues and the prison issues, I think economic justice issues are equally strong, equally intertwined. And we have a chance to do something about them after literally 30 years of going the other direction in this country. So that's what I'm going to focus on.
And as you mentioned, we're also going to be looking at putting together a property tax.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we were both on the property tax relief task force. Is that right? 2 summers ago. And I chaired the TIF subcommittee. Mark chaired the PTEL subcommittee, which focuses on some artificial limitations that actually end up driving your property taxes up. And that and a combination of other things, we're going to look to try to put together a comprehensive bill addressing different aspects of a lot of them hidden things that the public doesn't always have visibility to that are factors in driving up your property taxes. So look for more to come on that.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Senator Gillespie, Representative Walker. A couple of folks have asked, I believe, in the chat if we'll be sending out this presentation. I believe we will, and it has both our office's contact information in it. So obviously feel free to reach out to us anytime. I think, as I mentioned already, but there are a couple questions that were asked that will follow up directly our office as well with those constituents. Otherwise, I'll turn it back to you, Senator and Representative, for any closing remarks you might have.
I just want to thank you all for showing up tonight. I am very impressed at how many of you stayed for the whole 2+ hours. And I thank you. We really, your involvement as constituents, as voters, is really what makes us able to do our job. So we appreciate your involvement. I know we haven't been given the office closures during the pandemic, we haven't been as easy to connect with, but hopefully that'll start to open up, and our offices are open by phone, and we can have phone conversations with you if you have questions. We can have Zoom meetings, whatever you would like. I would very much like to continue the conversations. So please feel free to reach out as we go through, and thank you again, and be safe, be healthy, everyone.
Yeah, let me second that. be safe and be healthy. One thing I just wanted to say is that, you know, we've been living through very difficult times. I believe I can speak for Ann that we take our jobs very seriously and we take your input very seriously. And it is painful for us when we come to disagreements with our constituents, but it seems to be sometimes natural that there are many, many issues where we get the same number of people on one side of the issue as on the other side of the issue, and all responsible and all serious and all, you know, good people. But we have to struggle through this and we have to get to the other end. And I think we will. I think we're gonna, within a year from now, we're gonna be stunned at how well we're doing. That's my prediction. So I look forward to it. Thank you.